So I have a small confession to make before I start, which is that I'm a little intimidated by this amazing podium. I feel like I'm going to take a wood lift off, which is a good thing. So hopefully I can do it honor. So today I want to talk about the science of leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I mean leading within your company, outside of your company, leading with your ideas, making sure that your pitches are heard. And so leadership, in terms of research, has some really interesting secrets to share. Before I get started, so I run a human behavior research lab here in Portland, and we have about 60,000 people who participate in our lab. And we ask them all kinds of inappropriate personal questions for our own amusement, looking for patterns. And one of the quick surveys, we do these little 1 to 2 minute surveys for people. And one of the questions that we asked was, what is the most important trait of a leader? And we gave them a list of hundreds of positive terms. And we had over 10,000 people take this little quiz, and we were looking to see, is there a consensus? And we expected to see a top 5. But one term won out above all others, so far that there really wasn't even a second, third, or fourth. Charisma seemed to captivate the minds of people, and when they thought of a leader, it was like charisma was synonymous with that term. The question is, what is charisma? A lot of us, when we think about charisma, we don't exactly know what it is. So when you look at charisma from a scientific perspective, charisma is actually the perfect balance of 2 personality traits. It's the perfect balance of warmth and competence. Sorry if it's a little off. So if someone is just warm, they're seen as incredibly sweet, collaborative, a good team player, relatable, but not very impressive, not very smart, and not very credible. If someone is just competent, they're seen as smart, dependable, important, powerful, but they're not seen as a good team player and not collaborative. So the sweet spot, people who are ranked highest in charisma, have this perfect blend. They're high in both warmth and competence. And so that's what I actually want to focus on today. I want to focus on the sweet spot of warmth and competence, because when people are both warm and competent, they increase admiration and respect. That's where I'm going to be focusing a lot of our research on today. The other thing that's interesting about leadership is we're actually very good as humans as quickly detecting if someone is a leader or not. Now, in our minds, we don't think that we can do this, but Nalini Ambady at Tufts University did a really fascinating study. What she wanted to know is, can we tell how much of a leader someone is just based on their face? So she brought participants into her lab at Tufts, and she showed them a grid of pictures like this. Now, these pictures come from the Fortune 1000 list. The top 6 of them come from the top, they're unrecognizable CEOs from the top of that list, and the other 6 are from the bottom of that list, so they're the bottom of the Fortune 1000 list. Now, she only took unrecognizable CEOs. As we know, Mark Zuckerberg is pretty successful, and she asked people, based on these faces, who do you think is a leader? Who do you think falls at the top of that list? What was surprising was not only could participants accurately guess the top 6 leaders just based on their profile, but the longer she gave them to guess, the worse their ratings became. So the longer we think about someone and their leadership qualities, the worse we get. Our first impression, our gut instinct on someone is incredibly accurate. So what I thought we would do is play a little game. So I want to play this game together. We ran this experiment in our own lab with different headshots. So these are 3 different CEOs. If you had to look at these pictures, now I'm tricking you a little bit because I'm leaving this slide up for kind of a long time, longer than I should. Are you second guessing yourself? Just a little bit? Okay, so if you had to guess who is on the top of the Fortune 1000 list, how many people think A? How many people think B? So look around, the majority of the room. How many people think C? So you are right, it is B. And I've done this with thousands of audiences around the world. And almost every single time, the majority of the audience will get the answer right. Shall we play again? Should we try again? So one thing that we did in our lab is I wanted to see if this worked in real life, beyond just CEOs. So we took pictures of people on Twitter. Now, one of these women has 100 followers. One of these women has 1,000 followers, and one of these women has 10,000 followers. If I were to ask you to guess, based on just their picture, who has more followers, do you think you could do it? So how many people think it's A? How many people think it's B? How many people think it's C? So the answer is A. And what's interesting is people get so upset when they get it wrong. So the interesting thing is I kept that slide up for way longer than I should have. In fact, we found that under a second is the most accurate. That's actually when people are the most accurate. So I kept that slide up for about 10 or 15 seconds while I was talking. So we're going to play it again with the men. But this time I'm going to keep the slide up for a very, very short amount of time, and we're going to vote immediately. Are you ready? This time I think we're going to get more of it right because it will go faster. So of these men, how many people think A, B, or C has the most followers? How many people think it's A? How many people think it's B? How many people think it's C? Absolutely right. So the majority of the room guessed B. So the question is, with these, and we can play these games over and over again. I could show you lots of pictures. What are the patterns? Why is it that certain faces look more powerful to us? Why is it that we can look at someone or meet someone and decide, wow, that person is charismatic? What is it about them that makes us feel that way? So what we did is we analyzed thousands and thousands of pictures and headshots. We also analyzed hundreds of hours of TED Talks. We're fascinated by pitches. We wanted to know what's the difference between a viral TED Talk, a TED Talk that gets 25 million views, and a TED Talk on the same topic that only gets 25,000. So that's what I'm going to be presenting for you today. The very first pattern that we found is that leaders instantly indicate their credibility to the people around them, and another word for high competence. And this centers around something called the microexpression. So the microexpression is a very brief, involuntary facial expression that we all make across genders and races when we feel an intense emotion. What I want to do, there's actually 7 different microexpressions. Since I only have 40 minutes today, I'm going to teach you the ones that are most important for entrepreneurs. And it was fascinating watching those words come up. Entrepreneurs, investor, researchers. So hopefully this will be right up your alley. So the very first microexpression that we all make is fear. Now, fear is a really interesting expression because it comes on our face to protect us. The reason for this is because when we are afraid of something, let's say that you're hiking in Forest Park and you see a snake. Immediately, your eyes and your eyebrows widen to take in as much of the environment as possible in case if there's another snake or you have to escape. Your mouth drops open so that you can scream for help or take in oxygen in case you have to fight or flight. So we make these faces without even realizing we're afraid. So what we found is that when you show someone a scary picture or you surprise them in one of those really mean YouTube videos, you've ever seen those where it's like a beautiful meadow and you're watching it and all of a sudden a really scary face comes up? So we found that people will make the fear facial expression before their brain realizes they've even seen something scary. And that is because our face protects us. It opens up our eyes and opens up our mouth to make sure that we can run away or see what we need. The problem is we actually make this expression all the time. And the more fear expressions someone makes, the lower their credibility. When you watch presidential debates, you'll notice that the debaters, the candidates who have very high nerves, will actually peel back their eyes so you see the top whites of their eyes as they're speaking. We recognize that as a fear cue, and we go, we don't want to be led by someone who has a lot of fear or high anxiety. So you'll notice in pictures, you'll see just the top whites of someone's eyes. So what I highly recommend you do after this presentation is open up your LinkedIn profile, look at your headshot, watch a video of you pitching, and count how many times you can see the upper whites above your pupils. Every time you do that, you're telling someone that you feel afraid of what you're saying. Leaders are very good at keeping their face incredibly calm. So here's a couple more examples of when we see the whites of someone's eyes. You'll often see people will be smiling on the bottom half of their face, but their eyelids are peeled back to indicate high anxiety. The second microexpression that we see is contempt. Now, contempt is the most powerful of the microexpressions. It's also the most simple. So contempt, disdain, hatred, this is when we do a one-sided mouth raise, kind of like a smirk. So you can try it right now if you want. You'll kind of begin to feel a little sarcastic, kind of attitude-y. Don't do it for too long. So contempt, what's interesting about it is most people think that contempt is partial happiness. They think, well, if I smirk, it makes me look like I'm not too into it, but I'm still a little excited. The problem is when you have a headshot or a picture or you punctuate your sentences with contempt, you're telling people that you are negative and you don't believe that what you're saying is going to have a positive impact. It is an incongruency. When people see contempt, when you have positive words, they see that your words and your facial expressions don't match. It's one of the biggest indications of lie detection. When we talk about human lie detection, contempt along with happiness words is typically when you can see that there's a mismatch. Here's why I think contempt is the most powerful. So Dr. John Gottman is a marriage and family counselor up in Seattle, and he does amazing research on couples. And he did one of the biggest experiments we've ever seen on marriage and love. What he did is he brought a couple hundred couples into his lab, his love lab, and he tested them on everything he could think of. Urine samples, blood samples, hair samples. He tested their IQ, their DNA. He tested their saliva. He interviewed their kids, their families. He even watched them on videotape in a bed and breakfast scenario to see if he could see any body language or physical patterns that were different. He looked at all this data from all these couples, and he followed them for 30 years, checking in with them every single year. Can you imagine the amount of data he had to go through? At the end of the 30 years, he wanted to know which couples got divorced and which couples stayed together. And were there any ways to predict which couples got divorced? After all this data, there was only one single indicator to show you which couple would get divorced and which couples would stay together. With 93.7% accuracy, which you do not hear very much, he can predict if a couple will get divorced within 30 years just by looking for the contempt microexpression. So he found that couples that showed contempt in their initial intake interview, with 93.6% accuracy, they would get divorced within 30 years. That's a crazy, crazy stat. Contempt is the very small kernel. It's the start of disrespect. It's the start of hate. And so please look at your profile pictures and make sure you are not showing that contempt or that smirk. You also want to watch out for contempt and fear on your investor's face. So when you're going through a pitch, especially if you have a highly technical concept, you want to make sure that you spot fear and address it right away. The biggest mistake that we see with entrepreneurs with technical ideas is they get in the room with an investor and they have a script, right? They have a script and a pitch they want to go through. And so they pull out their deck and they go through the pitch and they don't even look at their investor's face or the client's face. If they were to look at their face, they would realize that as soon as they say a concept that just is a little bit unclear, we tend to show fear when we are confused. So if you are looking at your investor or your client's face and you spot that fear, you can actually stop the presentation and say, can I go back and explain anything? That's one of the most powerful things you can do when you have a technical presentation, is actually respond to the emotions that your investor or your client is giving you. We notice contempt in celebrities that we don't like. It irritates us just a little bit. So what's interesting is when politicians show contempt, their approval ratings drop. And that is because we know as humans, we intuitively pick up on contempt as a really negative expression. Let's go into a more positive one. So happiness. Most people think that happiness is just a smile. The only true indicator of happiness is not a smile. We know this, right? If we ever give our mother news and she's like, oh yeah, I'm so happy for you. Mm-hmm. And that smile just doesn't reach the top of her face. That is because the only true indicator of happiness is actually when these upper cheek muscles are engaged. If you want to feel the difference, by the way, if you smile and put your finger between your teeth and widen your lips as wide as possible, like that, you can consciously activate those muscles. Only 1 in 10 people can activate those muscles on purpose. The reason why this is important in our careers is because the absence of happiness is more important than actually seeing happiness. If someone says, yeah, I really like your idea, I'll get back to you, and they're giving you that smile, it just doesn't quite reach up to the top of their cheeks, you know you have not sold them yet. You have more selling to do. And that is because there's an absence of genuine happiness. We also pick up on actresses who have not Botoxed their smile wrinkles. So whenever I give this presentation in Los Angeles, people get really upset with me because I can't even read the faces of my audience members. And that is because they found that women and men who have Botoxed their smile wrinkles actually feel less happy as long as that Botox is in their face. And that is because our facial expressions are a feedback loop. When we feel happy, we show a happy facial expression, which makes us feel more happy, which is an interesting loop. So actresses or singers or politicians who don't smile with their full face, they make us feel a little like they're not real. They're a little inauthentic. So I want to show you a very quick video because most people don't believe me that first, we show microexpressions from a very young age, and second, as humans, we go from one extreme emotion to the next very quickly. So I want you to use this baby as an example. When you're pitching your investor, you're looking for the same kind of emotions on their face. Are you ready? So we're going to see two of the emotions we just learned. So, I show this video because this baby doesn't even have eyebrows yet, but we can still see the fear and happiness on their face. And the same thing happens when we're with people. I will tell you, I watch The Bachelor for work, the reality show The Bachelor for work. You can always know who's going to get voted off because of the expressions on their face. The same thing happens in meetings. If you are in a pitch or a script and you don't pause to respond to their natural emotion, their fear or confusion, their absence of genuine happiness, or their contempt at an idea. So one of the things that we do on our blog is we watch Shark Tank and we try to guess which deals are going to happen based on just the micro-expressions on the shark's face. And you'll notice that every single time they are disappointed with a number or a revenue or a background, they will show contempt or sadness or anger. Always on their face, that comes through before they have to say a word. The best entrepreneurs, the best pitchers, pick up on those individual facial expressions and then address them and say, let me go into that number. Let me go into where we got that number a little bit more. And they can dispel that emotion right away. So let's talk about first impressions. As I talked about, that gut instinct is hugely important. I wanted to show you a study that talks about how we judge someone incredibly quickly. Especially, there was a pitch fest here yesterday. Most of us, even though we don't like to admit it, decided how much we liked someone just based on how they took the stage. And to prove this point, there was a study that was done in Austria. What they did was they took hundreds of videos of violinists, and they split them up into 3 different trials. In the first trial, they had participants watch a video of just the violinist entering the stage. So here's what that looked like. And they asked these people, how talented is this violinist, just by their stage entrance? So you haven't heard her play a single note. If I were to ask you how talented is this violinist, do you think that you could tell me? So your brain just did something crazy. I just made it do something crazy. It was part of your brain was like, no way, I haven't seen this violinist speak. But the other part of your brain was like, oh yeah, I know how talented this violinist is. And that is because, as much as we don't like to admit it, within the first second of meeting someone, we make a judgment of them. In the second trial, what they did, just for fun, is they had them watch the stage entrance and the first note. That looked a little bit like this. Just that. So after the first note, do you think you could tell us how talented this violinist is? And of course, in the last trial, I'll give you a little bit of what her performance actually looked like. So when they compared all three of these results, just the stage entrance in the first note, and the stage entrance in the entire performance, they found that the ratings were exactly the same. People liked the violinist. They decided how much they liked a violinist the moment they entered the stage. It had very little to do with what their playing was actually like. Now, this is kind of a terrifying idea for entrepreneurs. Right? I work with a lot of entrepreneurs who are pitching. And it's crazy to think that you spend hours and hours and hours on your pitch, and your stage entrance is actually the most important part of that entire pitch. Now, let me talk about what goes into that pitch, why there are certain things that matter more, how we know someone's a leader just by how they take the stage. So first, we noticed that leaders make a very specific eye pattern on people's face, not only in the audience when they're looking out at the audience, but also one-on-one in coffee meetings or investor meetings. We all know the importance of eye contact. Whenever I tell people I teach the science of body language, they say, oh yes, a good handshake, good eye contact, and good posture. That's a very small part of the story. We know that eye contact produces oxytocin, a hormone that helps us bond with other people. But what we don't realize is there are actually 3 different kinds of eye contact, that leaders make different types of eye contact on other people's face to cue or to signal that they are a person in a position of leadership. We notice that CEOs and the most successful pitching entrepreneurs do what's called power gazing. When we use eye tracking behavior, they meet someone and they make a very specific pattern on the other person's face with their eyes. They bounce between their eyes and their forehead, and they keep the gaze incredibly high. We found that this is a social signal, that people who are high in testosterone, both men and women, know that they are social alphas, or they feel confident and competent, and they cue this to other people by making this kind of power gaze on their face. We found that people who are friendly, they're in friendly relationships, they actually flip their gaze down. They do what's called social gazing. So they bounce between the eyes and the mouth. What's interesting is that many women have been taught appeasement body language from a very young age, that you should make friends with everyone, that you should be a good team player. And so people tend to default to social gazing, even in business environments, which actually cues the other person to say, I'm more warm and friendly than I am competent and credible. That gazing is something that we do instantly when we meet someone to see how do they feel about themselves and how do they feel about our relationship. The last one, and this is not a dating seminar, is intimate gazing. Intimate gazing, we drop a little bit lower to our suprasternal notch right here in between the collarbones. That's because we're trying to take in their hormone levels to assess them as a potential mate. And anytime we do use this in business environments, we get that kind of creepy vibe. If you've ever been with someone and you're like, gosh, I don't feel so comfortable, I'm getting the heebie-jeebies, it's probably because you're being intimate gazed with. So I just want to talk for a second about appropriate eye contact. So another big mistake we make, we love to observe people in speed networking environments and videotape them and code their body language and give them feedback on who got the most business cards, who got the most deals out of those networking events. What we found was that people who were told, make good eye contact, try to make 100% eye contact. Have you ever been talking to someone and they're like boring into you with their eye contact? So what's interesting is that 100% eye contact is actually a territorial cue. When we are made eye contact with 100% of the time, it's actually a pre-fight cue that we do with someone. So 100% eye contact is actually very invasive. The sweet spot is 60 to 70%. Below 60% is considered avoidant. So I'd just like to clarify how much is good eye contact. When I talk about the 3 different kinds of gazing, power, social, and intimate, there's not one right kind. It really depends on what kind of relationship you want to have with the person. What I want you to think about is how you can be purposeful with your gazing. Over lunch today, over the next set of networking events, I want you to pay attention to what you default to. Are you typically keeping your gaze very high in the power gazing area, or are you flipping down to social gazing? That is going to be incredibly helpful for you to know because those are the cues, the signals you're sending off to investors, to clients, to customers, and make sure you use that purposefully. fourth, let's talk about pitch power. So one of the experiments we did, I'm a TED Talk junkie. I love watching TED Talks. And I was sitting and I was searching through TED during lunch. I watch a TED Talk every day during lunch. And I looked for a topic on success. And I was looking through the TED.com search field. And I searched success, and there was two different talks that came up. One was Simon Sinek's talk about leadership, which has over 25 million views, I think 22.3 million views at this point. And there was a very similar talk with almost the same title that came out the same month of the same year, September 2009, as Simon Sinek's talk. But that talk had less than 40,000 views. And I looked at these two talks with almost the same title, and I went, why did one talk go viral and one talk didn't? How is it that one pitch can come on stage and that's the pitch that everyone's talking about afterwards? So what we did was I wanted to do an experiment in our lab where we took all of the top TED Talks from the year 2010 and all of the bottom TED Talks, the least viewed and the most viewed TED Talks, and we watched and analyzed them for patterns. Then we had about 15,000 people watch these TED Talks and rate the speakers on different characteristics: charisma, credibility, intelligence, and overall quality. We wanted to see if you didn't show people the view count and they just watched the first 7 seconds of the talk versus the entire 18 minutes, was there differences? And we found that there were very, very specific differences between the top and bottom TED Talks when you looked at them. When you watch the talks on mute, you'll notice that the top TED Talks, and you can go play in our lab if you would like, the top TED Talks let their hands do the talking. In other words, the best TED Talkers would often take the stage and they would say, today I want to talk to you about a big idea. I'm going to break it down into 3 different parts, and then we're going to go over the specific things that we can do to change your life. They would use their words along with their hands. It was almost as if they were talking to you on 2 different tracks. And what we found is this was very easy to spot. In fact, you could tell if a talk was going to go viral within the first 7 seconds just by looking at the amount of hand gestures. The top TED Talks, and we painstakingly counted each and every one, have an average of 465 hand gestures in 18 minutes. That's a lot of hand gestures. The bottom TED Talks have an average of 272 hand gestures in 18 minutes. That's a major difference, and we think is for 18 minutes, it's very hard for our brain to pay attention, especially if you're pitching a bunch of investors who've sat all day listening to talks. If you're giving them 2 different tracks to listen to your talk, with your hands as well as your words, it's just easier for their brains to pay attention for longer periods of time. So I think I have this fact for you. So you have 465 versus 272, very easy to tell. And we also noticed that not only were those hands visible, so out of pockets above the desk, typically, even if they had a podium, their hands were always above the podium, whereas the low TED Talkers tended to speak with their hands hidden behind the podium or behind their back. They would walk the stage with their hands behind their back and not visible. And that is because our hands are actually our trust indicators. This is because when we use our hands, it actually helps us explain our ideas. So when you look at your pitch, especially your elevator pitch, I challenge you to think about how can you use your hands to explain your words. The most popular ones we see in TED Talks are combining. So I combine Uber with Yelp and make it into my app, right? They use that combining gesture. Or numbers, right? They always will use their hands to tell you what number they're on. Growth. Every investor wants to see the hockey stick chart in a entrepreneur presentation. And so what we noticed that a lot of entrepreneurs also use their hands to indicate growth in addition to their words. So they'll say, oh man, this year was explosive in growth. Or we just took off this year, as a way of underlining or bolding their words. And lastly, we also noticed that entrepreneurs who were talking about a personal passion tended to gesture to their chest or heart area more often. And that cued people to understand this was something that they really felt intimate and good about and strong behind. Let me talk about the last one, which is vocal power. Second to last one. So one interesting study about vocal power looked at doctors. And they wanted to know if you could see how powerful or how credible a doctor is just by their voice tone. So if you do a lot of phone calls or a lot of phone pitching, sometimes you'll notice that you'll pick up the phone and someone will instantly like or not like you. And that is because we pick up a lot of cues from vocal power. So in this study, what they did is they took doctors and they asked them to record a 10-second recording of them saying their name, the hospital they worked at, and their specialty. So it sounded something like, "Hello, my name is Dr. Green. I work at Children's Presbyterian Hospital, and I specialize in pediatric cancer." Something like that. They took this 10-second clip and they warbled the words. So they made it sound like, so you couldn't understand any of the words, but the voice tone, the volume, the cadence, the pace was exactly the same. Then they asked participants to rate these clips on warmth and competence, the two most important factors for charisma. What they found was that the doctor clips that got rated the lowest in warmth and competence matched the doctors that had the highest rate of malpractice lawsuits. Now, this was the first of many studies that looked at this, but what they found is that we don't sue doctors based on their abilities. We sue doctors based on our perceptions of their abilities. And we decide right away how warm and competent someone is, and a lot of that has to do with our voice tone. So I wanted to show you two of the things that we learned from not only TED Talks, but also successful pitches, Shark Tank pitches as well as Pitch Fest pitches, of what were the vocal cues of charisma. How do you have both high warmth and high competence? The first one was we noticed that all of the successful pitches used the lowest natural end of their voice tone. And this doesn't mean that they had the lowest of the low. It means that they used the baritone part of their voice. So for example, we all have a range in our voice tone. And with breath, we can actually relax our vocal cords. This is a really clever thing that our brain does. Because when we're anxious, our vocal cords will kind of tense a little bit. And we go into vocal fry, and we go higher. And all of you picked up on the fact that I was nervous. Subconsciously or consciously, you heard my vocal cords tense. We do not want a leader who is tense. And so when we hear someone in the lowest end of their tone, we pick up on the fact that they are confident in what they're saying. So when you're speaking, I highly recommend that you practice keeping your voice tone low and get your testosterone high, which is the last tip that we're going to talk about. The other thing that we noticed very specifically was that any time a pitcher used the question inflection, their competence ratings plummeted. So the question inflection is when you make a statement sound like a question. You go up at the end of your statement. So it sounds like, "My name is Vanessa." Every single time when you ask people to dial, so we had investors use dials on warmth and competence, anytime someone used the question inflection, the dials went all the way down to the low side in low confidence. And that is because when we're unsure of ourselves, we ask, we don't say. So what I would recommend you do is next time you're on the phone, record it. Use that voice memo app in your phone, and then go back and listen to it. It will be horrible and painful. It will be horrible to listen to your own voice. And count how many times you use the question inflection when you weren't actually asking a question. Practice saying the hardest parts of your pitch, specifically the number. Oftentimes we notice that in sales and when people are asking for money, they're doing really great. They're like, "We really would love your investment. It would support us for growth for the next year. And we're asking for $1 million? That's basically you're telling them you're not really sure about that number. You're begging them to negotiate with you, right, when we do that. So practice saying the hardest parts of your pitch. Like say it like you mean it. Don't ask it. The last one, which I talked about testosterone for low tone, the biggest help for keeping your tone nice and low is actually having high levels of testosterone. This is for both men and women. So there was a study that was done by Amy Cuddy at Harvard Business School, and she looked at high power and low power body language. When we talk about low power body language, this is very easy. Anytime our body takes up a little bit of space, we actually go into a defeated pose. Have you ever watched an athlete win or lose a race? So if you watch an athlete during the Olympics lose a race, it's like they crumple their body in at the end. They grip their hands into fists, they roll their shoulders in, and they crouch down into a standing fetal position. This is because when we feel like a loser, our brain tells our body, "Don't take up a lot of space, protect yourself." The problem is we do this in real life when we're feeling anxious. When we feel anxious, we tend to cross our arms over our chest. We might cross our legs tightly. We roll our shoulders in. And this actually makes us feel even lower confidence. What's interesting about this is most people tell me, Vanessa, I have really good posture. This isn't a problem for me. But have any of you ever checked your phone? Ever? Every single time we check our phone, we accidentally go into low power body language. We roll our shoulders in, and we tuck our chin to our chest, and we actually go into a small fetal position while we're waiting. So the problem is we're waiting in a waiting room for someone, like a client or an investor, and they open the waiting room door, and we're hunched over our phone in this really low power position, and then we bounce up and shake their hand. The problem is your first impression was already made right when they open the door. Let's talk about high power. So high power body language is the exact opposite. Have you ever seen an athlete win a race? Across cultures, across genders, when we win a race or when a child gets a cookie that they weren't expecting, they all do the same thing. They take up as much space as possible. Typically, they widen their hands and their arms, they tilt their face towards the sky, and they exclaim in happiness. And that is because that's the universal gesture of pride. And we notice that leaders take up more expansive positions. They tend to claim their space. And this is important because of, and I want to explain the science behind it, because of our hormone levels. So when we stand in expansive body language, Amy Cuddy found that we actually pump more testosterone. Testosterone, very simplified, is a strength hormone. When we have testosterone coursing through our body, we think faster, we run faster, it increases our metabolism. It is exactly what we want coursing through our bodies when we're doing an important pitch or a meeting. What's interesting is when we close our body, when we go into defeated body language, our body pumps cortisol. Cortisol, simplified, is the stress hormone. It makes us have dry mouth. It slows down our thinking. It makes us forget our entire pitch. It slows down our metabolism and causes us to gain weight. It is exactly what we don't want coursing through our bodies when we're going into an important pitch. So what's important is, I love high power, but I don't want you to walk into your meetings like this. It's a little socially aggressive, right? So while you're getting ready, by all means, power pose it up, right? Pump your favorite Britney music or Rocky music, whatever your favorite is, and get that testosterone pumping. When you go into the room, when you're in a networking event, I want to make sure you use something that I call your launch stance. So your launch stance, and this is what we found across the board. If you watch the first 7 seconds of TED Talks on mute, you will see that every single one of the top TED Talks, the most viewed TED Talks, are speaking in a launch stance like this. You can always see space between their arms and their torso. They typically have their hands visible and in front of them. They usually are standing at least hip-width apart. If you've watched Jamie Oliver's talk, he actually strides across the stage. He also yells at his audience. It's one of the most viewed TED Talks. And then they usually have their shoulders rolled back and their head high, so they're not turtling. The low talkers will often start off their talk something like this. Today I want to talk to you about. Subconsciously, we pick up on this testosterone level. They found that alphas, even chimps who are leaders of their pack, have higher levels of testosterone than everyone else. As soon as a chimp is dethroned from head of their social group, the replacement chimp, their testosterone levels immediately shoot up. So as humans, we pick up on leaders based on their exhibitions of their testosterone, how they hold their body. The nice thing about testosterone, it also keeps our voice nice and low. So when we have testosterone pumping through our body, it helps our vocal cords relax, it helps us stand more broadly, and we actually end up taking more risks. Amy Cuddy asked her participants to gamble after standing in different power poses, and she found that people who stood in high power poses, like Superman or Wonder Woman, they actually took more risks gambling and won more money. And that is because testosterone not only makes us we're not perceived as better, it makes us feel better. It makes us feel like we are luckier. So I want to end on a couple of extra notes for us, and then I'll take a couple of questions. We have 5 minutes for questions. One, I know I talked about a lot of skills and recommendations in today's presentation. Try to tackle one at a time. And the problem with this is if you try to do all at once, you end up kind of looking like a body language Frankenstein. So you're like, hand gestures, power posing, power gazing. And so one at a time is always the best way to do it. Learn that the hard way. The second one is that practice makes a leader. So I used to stand when I started this work. This was my typical stance. I crossed one leg over the other and I put one arm across my torso. It took me a while, a couple of weeks, to get into the muscle memory of being okay with having my arms loose by my side, especially on stage. The first few times on stage were really rough. But every single time you do it, you actually build more muscle memory. So when you are practicing your pitches, never practice sitting down. Always practice with the amount of space that you'll have on stage, because otherwise you forget how to use your space. We also have a ton of practice videos, as Mark so kindly pointed out on our website, that if you want to see me critique and be really mean to entrepreneurs, you can watch those videos. And lastly, your powers are very strong. Please use them for good and not evil. So I will take a couple of questions. We have, I think, 5 minutes for questions, right? Hopefully I haven't scared you away. Just power pose with me when you get up. Take the mic. Yes.
So I'm a psychologist, and I also love evolutionary biology. But what I have to assume is that some of those very kind of brief micro-expressions and like the stage entrance and things like that are things people watch for because at some level they actually function to kind of encapsulate some real information, because if they didn't, those snap judgments would be maladaptive. And obviously they're fallible, but they're not overall maladaptive. So I guess the question is, what is it that's getting encapsulated? Like when you look at the violinist, is that kind of some way conveys the accumulation of her experience or other people's responses to her over time, or what do you think it is that would actually create some predictive validity in those snap judgments?
Sure. So part of it is social proof, right? Like how loud was the audience? Right, and how many handshakes did she shake, right? Because we definitely take cues from people around us. That's why you'll notice sometimes politicians, so I work with a lot of politicians, they'll take the stage and they'll be like, hey, how are you? Hi, how you doing? They don't know anyone, usually. They're coached to do that because of social proof. So yes, so social proof is part of it. Part of it is we're trying to gauge, just like we do with a potential mate, how much testosterone do they have, how much cortisol do they have pumping through their bloodstream, because we figure that if someone has high levels of testosterone, they're probably a good leader and they have less anxiety. Now, our first impressions are about 76% accurate in terms of personality judgment. So with the big five, we are 76% accurate in judging someone's openness, agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and extroversion. So that means there's room, right, for them to correct that first impression. But what we're doing is, unfortunately, what they found is that people will make a judgment, first impression judgment, and even though they're not 100% correct, typically anything you do either proves it or is an exception to the rule. In other words, if someone takes the stage and they're really confident and they wave and they nod and they have their hands nice and visible, you go, ooh, this person's going to be good. And they tell a really good story and you're like, see, I knew they were good. And they make kind of a bad joke or they say a bad statistic and you're like, well, I can write that off. So unfortunately, even though we are not 100% accurate, we have a lot of trouble integrating the content that we hear into that first impression or changing that first impression. Hope that I know that didn't completely answer your question, but yeah.
So my question was related to the art of body language, and we are trying to learn some of it here.
Yes.
But if you looked at the audience, the leaders that you showed pictures of, if they took the same class and they mastered the art of how to present and how to do things on the stage, do you think they'll be as good a leader as a genuine, the one who did not see this, who did not know about this, but had the postures which indicated that the person is a good leader? Can we eventually differentiate? Because over time, assuming you're widely, everybody reads all this and everybody knows about this.
Yeah.
Would they be able to fool us?
So it's a really good question about how do you fake it till you make it, right? Does inauthenticity come through? So inauthenticity always comes through. Incongruencies, we cannot control our microexpressions. They are involuntary facial expressions. So you'll know a leader when they've been trained in the art of body language, but they don't actually feel confident with their pitch, right? Like they do like cues that are a little delayed, just slightly. They will show contempt and fear, even though their body is saying that they're good. So inauthenticity always comes through. And there's also, charisma doesn't come in one flavor. So you'll notice that the best leaders have kind of their own unique brand of charisma, right? Some leaders have this quiet power, right? They have very little movement, very little head and facial expressions, but you can feel that power and testosterone. They're still standing broadly. Their hands are still visible, but they don't move their hands a lot. They might keep them very, very small movements. Whereas other leaders are incredibly charismatic in terms of an energy, right? They come up on stage and they're like charging across the stage. They're razzle-dazzling you with their hands. They have a very different look. It's not the same kind of body language, but the underlying subconscious principles that we pick up on, fear, testosterone, cortisol, we still are like, okay, it looks different than the last guy, but he's still a leader. So I don't think, and it's a really good point, that when I talk about these cues, practice them as you. If there is something in your presentation that you are lying about, do not say it, right? Because that will come through. If you are not 100% confident that your pitch and your idea should be heard and should be funded, you are not ready to present it. Because that will absolutely come through, and then that's your first impression. So I guess I make the assumption that everyone in here has amazing ideas they feel amazing about, they want to share in an amazing way. Amazing is the word of the day, I've decided. Yes. Oh, I think we have time for one more. One more? One more quick one. I'll be quick. Yeah.
Different genders, different kinds of ways that we are treated, you know. Oh, no.
Yes, so is there any differences between men and women or specific tips? First, women tend to default to social gazing, whereas men tend to default to power gazing. So for women in the audience, figure out where you default, and next time you are in an investor meeting or you're meeting with a VIP, practice power gazing. So you're not sending off social cues when you should be sending off power cues. That's the most important one for women. For men, sometimes men can come across as less warm and more competent, especially men in leadership positions. So one way that you can soften, you can come across as both warm and competent, not imposing, not intimidating, is softening, having a little bit more head movement. So the head tilt is the universal cue for listening. For example, if I were to say, "Do you hear that?" Everyone kind of tilts their head and listens. So if you are listening to someone or you want to show that you're listening to an investor and you really want to get their feedback, a great way to do this is actually to slightly tilt your head, and you can even do a very slow triple nod. So 1, 2, 3. We found that when someone does a slow triple nod, the other person speaks 3 to 4 times longer. It's actually a nonverbal ... So if you want to show more warmth and engagement, those are 2 things that you can do to do that. Well, I think that my time is up. I want to thank you so much for giving me your morning session.